Us rediscovered the last edition this season of Building a Library. And it's the end of an epic journey in classical music, Beethoven's Final Piano Sonata, opus 111 in C minor, a work that's fascinated some of the great pianists on record, as we're about to find out. Pianist David Owen Norris is our expert guide to Beethoven's last sonata on instruments ancient and modern, and recordings from some of the most recent in the studio to live classics like this one.
Round about 1822, when Beethoven's last piano sonata was written, the chord of the diminished seventh, the dun-da-da-da-da, was turning into operatic code for horror. Weber's operas are full of it. Beethoven was no stranger to the chord. He'd used it in the introduction to another C minor sonata, the Pathétique, a quarter of a century earlier. But now he decided to exploit it to the full. There are only 3 different diminished seventh chords, if you ignore the different ways of spelling them with sharps and flats, and Beethoven starts by tearing through all 3 in quick succession. Edwin Fischer, live at the Salzburg Festival in 1954, and that was his beautiful version of the second movement's arietta we heard just before. In both extracts you could hear Fischer's great command of ebb and flow, which made him a revered guru to pianists like Daniel Barenboim and Ronald Smith. But he wasn't always at his happiest with lots of notes in public. He sensibly cut short a chord near the beginning there because he'd smudged it. It's a tricky piece, but what's more, it's a piece with a reputation, and it seems to put even great pianists off. Here's Clara Haskell, for instance, in 1953, wearing clogs to pedal by the sound of it, and with the same problem as Fischer, and a still greater disaster a few seconds later. Not quite the same inevitability of direction that Fischer achieved. Beethoven's used those 3 diminished seventh chords to take us somewhere not horrifying at all, almost comforting at the end there, on a chord of A flat. Hold that thought. Shura Tchaikovsky, another pianist with a beautiful natural lyrical delivery, in 1963, remastered on the Guild label. Notice how Beethoven's circling round C minor now, and what he's doing with the notes A flat and G. We heard them discordantly played together a few times, and the introduction ends by trilling on the two notes deep in the bass. Most pianists make this introduction weighty and portentous, but not Stephen Hough, who pays some attention to the metronome mark suggested by Beethoven's pupil Carl Czerny. He also invents a few rests to lighten the texture. Stephen Hough on a mixed recital disc from Hyperion in 2008, reminding us that maestoso means majestic, not slow. Compare Alfred Brendel in Snape Maltings in 1995 on Philips. A bit of singing there. I find such vocal pianists rather disturbing myself. Brendel takes getting on 3 times as long as Hough for that introduction. Slow on its own isn't a problem, mind you. It's the Pintoresque pauses. One of the slowest introductions is from Garrick Olson, but he just manages to twitch you along with him and then into a magnificent allegro. Garrick Olson on bridge, delivering the amazingly concentrated main theme. Beethoven had been thinking about this theme for 20 years. It's significant that it's only at this stage of his life that he knew what to do with it. By now, Beethoven's like some great orator who has won the ear of his listeners, some Winston Churchill. I make the analogy having just heard one of Churchill's later speeches for the first time. He didn't say very much, and he didn't need to. By Opus 111, Beethoven's at the stage where he can present cosmic simplicities and have them perceived as cosmic rather than simple. Because all that theme does is define C minor. G, in its dominant way, runs up to C, defining the keynote. E flat, bom, pa, tells us it's a minor key. B natural, the rather weird interval of a diminished fourth away, ba, ba, tells us that this is what we call chromatic music, literally colourful, lots of black notes among the white notes at any rate. And then it harps on that A flat G semitone. Ba-dum, bum, 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 ba-da-da-dim, ba-dum. It's time we listen to the man who's sometimes supposed to have made all subsequent Beethoven recordings redundant since he sat in Abbey Road in 1932, the great Arthur Schnabel. Arthur Schnabel on Naxos Historical. We might have expected the second theme of Beethoven's Allegro to arrive in the usual key, the major key with the same key signature as C minor, 3 flats. That's E flat, the relative major. But Beethoven is by now very bored with such ordinary ideas, so instead the theme turns up in A flat major. But he's prepared the way. Remember those significant A flats I mentioned? And there was that consoling touch of A-flat harmony way back in the introduction. Schnabel has a measured way of playing Beethoven which is immensely satisfying, and he doesn't try to seduce us with what I might call, even with the greatest admiration for it, mere piano playing. Because there are so very many recordings of Opus 111, and right from the earliest days of recording, this building a library seemed to me to be an opportunity to sample some pianists I don't hear enough of. Unfortunately, that means I might not have included your particular favourite, but at this stage of recording history, with a new complete Beethoven every year, we can't have everyone. I hope you'll like my recommendations, but I don't expect you to throw away the recordings you love already. Talking of which, here's Solomon, back in 1948, now on Testament. A marvellously stormy performance from Solomon Kuttner, to give him the full name he never used. And what about Wilhelm Backhaus, a man who heard Brahms conduct his second piano concerto and got his autograph, a man who played concertos himself with Hans Richter conducting. It's like meeting someone who fought at Waterloo. Backhaus recorded Opus 111 for the BBC in 1960. Not very good sound, I'm sorry to say, but his Salzburg recording is even worse, and by that time he was 82, which was very old, even so recently as 1966. So here's Backhaus, remastered by Testament, probably playing in the concert hall here at Broadcasting House. I mean, the Radio Theatre. The 76-year-old Wilhelm Backhaus negotiating the excitements of the development section. I love the slightly comical military march flavour he extracts from the theme at first, and then it's straight into deeply romantic Bach playing for the fugue. Here's Paul Lewis's take on that. Clean playing without Backhaus's twinkle, and oddly, less differentiation in the contrapuntal parts. Paul Lewis on Harmonia Mundi. I took my Southampton students on a trip to the Cobb collection of historical keyboard instruments last week at Hatchlands in East Grandon near Guildford. The great excitements of the Cobb collection are 3 pianos that Chopin played, including his own Pleyel, not to mention Haydn's Longman and Brodripp and Elgar's Broadwood. But the students also enjoyed playing Schubert and Beethoven on the Viennese pianos of that time. They all agreed that the music had to be quite different to be made to work on the piano it was intended for. So, it might be a good idea to listen to Opus 111 on a piano by Conrad Graf, the most admired of the Viennese piano makers, who gave an instrument to Beethoven soon after this sonata was composed. Here's Malcolm Binns in 1979 on the Explore label. Back in 1979, that was probably the best Viennese piano they could find. It's a restored instrument of 1835. It's interesting, but the clanging and the twanging makes you wish you could hear what it must have been like when it was new. Well, now we can. Here's Ronald Brautigam with Paul McNulty's brilliant modern copy of a Graf piano from 1819. Just listen to these freshly minted, sparkling semiquavers. Ronald Brautigam on Bis, playing a piano just like the new ones Beethoven had, and the only one of our pianists who dares to add an ornament. Jeremy Denk can sparkle on his Steinway too, and has a fine rhetorical delivery. Jeremy Denk on Nonsuch, coupled with the Ligeti Etudes. We are building a library with Beethoven's last piano sonata, opus 111. After a first movement all about stress and C minor, the second and last movement is nearly all in C major, a set of variations on an arietta. Stephen Huff plays it very expressively, faster than most. Solomon plays it slowly, but the way he shapes the melody stops it getting stuck. Solomon, sounding in D flat for some reason, so it might have been slower still at the original pitch. The usually excellent Garrick Olson comes a cropper in this simple tune. He plays it slower than half the speed Czerny recommended. Perhaps it could sometimes work in live performance, but I don't know. Garrick Olson. Even the delights of his fully restored 1919 Mason and Hamlin piano don't win me round, I'm afraid. Beethoven's first variation uses shorter notes, but he tells us not to speed up the beat. Most people do, even Schnabel, quite noticeably. The only adjective I can find for that sound, that way of playing, is noble. Edwin Fischer speeds up into the still shorter noted next variation as well, once again despite Beethoven's instruction. In fact, that's a lovely flowing speed, much faster than he played the Arietta, but Beethoven wanted a constant tempo. I think there are 3 reasons why people play the Arietta too slowly. One is the modern piano. Rondel Brautigam, on his 1819 Graf copy, doesn't have the temptation of cross-stringing and flexed soundboards. Here's his tempo for the Arietta. And here's the passage from the second to the third variation, all within 5% or so, the same beat. Brautigam's speeds allow us to hear the structure of the theme clearly. Some listeners of a certain age may remember a weekly Radio 3 programme a quarter of a century ago called The Works, which I presented. One week we got a live feed from a trawler in the South Atlantic and spoke to a man who was recording the song of the humpbacked whale. Using very primitive digital processing, we managed to speed up the song while keeping its pitch where humans could still hear it. And we discovered that the song had quite a catchy rhythmic structure, which no one could apprehend at the slow original speed. What some pianists are trying to do in the Arietta, it seems to me, is to produce music that only whales think slowly enough to appreciate. I once had a student who wrote the marvellous sentence, "Luckily, Beethoven lived long enough to complete his set of 32 piano sonatas." Opus 111 is often seen in that way, as a conscious valediction, but that burdens it with perhaps more extraneous meaning than it should bear. The next variation has nothing valedictory about it. Paul Lewis, slowing down only a bit for that very vigorous variation. Now the music slackens. The next variation exploits what Andras Schiff, in a lecture on the piece, describes as darkness and light. That's to say, the lower part of the keyboard and the higher part of the keyboard. Tchaikovsky does it beautifully. Shura Tchaikovsky. So Andras Schiff identified another cosmic simplicity. Low notes, dark. High notes, light. A few minutes ago I said there were 3 reasons why pianists might play the arietta too slowly. One was the modern instrument, another extraneous meaning. The last, I think, is a too ready persuasion that none of our listeners will hear Beethoven's cosmic simplicities as merely simple. But the 1927 Beethoven centenary number of the periodical Music and Letters carried a speech for the opposition, which spoke of Beethoven's extreme subjectiveness and seriousness, coupled sometimes with a certain triteness of material, which is so often relentlessly developed to its utmost logical conclusion. On the other hand, Maynard Solomon has written of Beethoven, masterpieces of art are instilled with a surplus of constantly renewable energy, an energy that provides a motive force for changes in the relations between human beings. Moral improvement is not the whole end of art, you may well think, but it does seem to be an important part of Beethoven. I suspect that the slogan, "Beethoven is good for you," tempts some pianists to forget ordinary musical things. Beethoven doesn't forget. We've had a lot of C major, so he trills his way to a new key, the very key, E-flat, that he decided not to use for his second subject in the first movement. Here's Alfred Brendel. For my taste, Brendel doesn't so much find meaning in the music as apply meaning to the music. I feel that this is Brendel's Beethoven. In a way, I don't find myself thinking, this is Schnabel's Beethoven. Some of the other pianists, Solomon, Lewis, fail the same very subjective test. Others Fischer, Haskell, have too many slips, and some, while not applying meaning, perhaps don't find enough. Even Bach has. Schnabel, in one of the first recordings he ever made, dropped a few notes, and the sound quality, of course, is not very good. But although he didn't make other recordings redundant, he's absolutely unignorable. I very much like Stephen Huff's recording, and Tchaikovsky's. And there are excellent recordings that we haven't even had time to hear today. Ronald Smith's, for instance, or Andras Schiff. Ronald Brautigam is marvellous. I love the sound of his gruff. Perhaps it takes a bit of getting used to. Beethoven brings the tune back now, without repeats, swelling to a triumph. But Jeremy Denk has wonderful climaxes too, and an understanding of Beethoven's syntax that allows him to deliver it rhetorically, but without putting on the pianistic equivalent of the voice of an actor. A modern pianist, in short, who knows all the old stuff. Yes, if you're one of those people who don't like the sound of early pianos, then my recommendation is Jeremy Denk, and you'll enjoy his Ligeti too. You will. But Ronald Brautigam's performance is so colourful, so brilliant, and yet so sincere that he's my top choice of all. If you think you don't like the sound of those old brown pianos, it'll be a tonic. Brautigam, like Denk, like Schnabel, is an orator, and once again an orator with a beguiling tone of voice. Those trills sound wonderful on the graph.
The end of the first movement of Beethoven's last piano sonata, opus 111 in C minor. That was Ronald Brautigam playing it on a modern copy of a Graf forte piano, and for all the reasons he just gave us, Brautigam is David Owen Norris's overall Building a Library recommendation. Well, that's from his complete cycle of the Beethoven sonatas for the BIS label, so you can download opus 111 on its own or buy it as a single hybrid SACD. It's volume 8 of the series, and it comes alongside Brautigam's performances of 3 other late Beethoven sonatas. But if the sound of that Graf copy, or indeed forte pianos in general, is not to your particular taste, then Norris's alternative recommendation comes into play. Jeremy Denk playing Beethoven's Opus 111 alongside Etudes by Ligeti, and that's from Nonsuch. Details of both recordings are on the CD Review website. And Radio 3's Essential Classics will be giving you the chance to hear for yourself at full length why Norris is so enamoured of Brautigam's Beethoven, his complete performance of the C minor sonata in Monday morning's edition of the programme just after 11 a.m.